Hello guys, so today we'll be learning about edema. Edema is a huge topic, so we have been divided into parts. Today we'll be learning the basics of edema, and we will be learning edema under these headings: definition, classification, pathogenesis, which includes multiple mechanisms, and the important types of edemas. So basic of edema includes variety of pressures and normal fluid exchange that takes place. So which are different kinds of pressures that are included in this process? First is the osmotic pressure. It is nothing but the pressure exerted by the chemical constituents of the body fluids. And the hydrostatic pressure is the pressure exerted by the capillary blood or the interstitial fluid. Osmotic pressure is again of two types: a crystalloid osmotic pressure and a colloid osmotic pressure. Colloid osmotic pressure is also known as oncotic pressure. So crystalloid osmotic pressure is more in number, like 80%, constitutes 80% of the osmotic pressure, whereas the oncotic pressure is due to the proteins and constitutes only the 20% of the whole osmotic pressure, but it is physiologically more important. Again, the oncotic pressure in the plasma is the 25 mmHg and interstitial fluid oncotic pressure is 8 mmHg. So basically, what does the osmotic pressure is? Osmotic pressure usually tend to draw the fluid into the vessel. In short, osmotic pressure or the oncotic pressure tend to accumulate fluid into the vessel or the capillary where it is. Then we move on to the hydrostatic pressure. Hydrostatic pressure again is of two types: capillary pressure and tissue tension. Here we are mostly focused on the capillary pressure. Capillary pressure is again of two types, on the arterial end and on the venous end. On the arterial end, capillary pressure is more, that is 32 mmHg, and on the venous end, it is less, that is 12 mmHg. So now, after we have understood the hydrostatic pressure and osmotic pressure, let us understand the normal fluid exchange that takes place. So as you can see, this is the capillary, this is the arterial end, and this is the venous end. At the arterial end, as we know, the hydrostatic pressure is 32 mmHg and osmotic pressure is 25 mmHg. So we get a 7 mm hydrostatic pressure in excess. Hydrostatic pressure usually tends to push the fluid out of the capillaries. Therefore, we see that the fluid from here is being pushed out into the interstitial space. And again, on the venous end, we see hydrostatic pressure is 12 mmHg and the osmotic pressure is 25 mmHg. So the difference is of 13 mmHg of oncotic pressure. And oncotic pressure, as we know, it tends to bring fluid into the capillary or accumulates fluid in a specific place. Therefore, the fluid is drawn back to the capillaries at the venous end. In this whole process of circulation, there is some fluid that is left in interstitial space. This fluid from interstitial space gets transferred via lymphatics and enters into the normal circulation. So this was basics of the different pressures and normal fluid exchange. So let's start with today's main topic, that is edema. Edema is nothing but abnormal and excessive accumulation of free fluids in interstitial tissue space or serous cavities. That is, the water gets accumulated in the free spaces in large amount, which causes pain and tenderness in the future. For your kind information, free fluid in body cavities is known as effusion, but free fluid in interstitial space is known as edema. Edema can be pitting or non-pitting. What do we mean by that? Pitting means if in the edema we press with two fingers and there is the presence of a temporary depression, then we call it a pitting edema. And when the depression is not present, that is a non-pitting edema. So now we move on to the classification of edema. Edema can be classified into localized edema and generalized edema. Localized edema is limited to a specific organ or a limb, and generalized edema results in a systemic disturbance, like the whole system gets affected in the generalized edema. Generalized edema is also known as anascara or dropsy. So these are the different kinds of localized edemas, and these are the kinds of systemic edema. So in inflammatory localized edema, the fluid that moves out and causes edema is exudate. And in generalized renal and cardiac edema, the fluid that causes edema is the transudate. So let's move on to pathogenesis of edema. What do we mean by pathogenesis? Pathogenesis is the progress of the disease, the progress of edema, how it takes place. So it occurs when normal fluid balance, normal lymph flow, or normal interstitial fluid gets disturbed. And how does this happen? How does this disturbance take place? There are 6 mechanisms via which this disturbance takes place. First is decreased plasma oncotic pressure. Second is increased capillary hydrostatic pressure. Third is lymphatic obstruction. Fourth is tissue factors. Fifth is increased capillary permeability. And sixth is sodium water retention. These are the 6 mechanisms by which the edema formation takes place. Let's focus on each of them specifically over here. First, decreased plasma osmotic pressure. The cause of plasma osmotic pressure to decrease is hypoproteinemia. Hypoproteinemia is the protein content is there is a lack of protein content in the plasma, due to which there is lowering of oncotic pressure, because oncotic pressure is the pressure exerted by the protein content. So it usually causes generalized edema. In all these kinds of mechanisms, the main important thing that we need to remember is the examples of these mechanisms and by which mechanism which edema is caused. So here it is renal edema and ascites of liver disease. Then we move on to increased capillary hydrostatic pressure. Again, the cause is the rise in capillary pressure near the venular end. As we know, near the venular end, the hydrostatic pressure is very low. And if there is an abnormal excessive increase in the capillary hydrostatic pressure at the venular end, there would be more liquid driving through the capillaries to the interstitial space, causing edema. Different kind of examples of this are cardiac edema, ascites of liver again, passive congestion, and postural edema. Then we come to the lymphatic obstruction. As we saw about that some fluid escapes in the interstitial space and then it travels to lymphatics and gets back into the normal circulation. But what if the lymphatic channel gets blocked? Yes, so there's a blockage in lymphatic channel which causes lymphedema. Example, radical mastectomy takes place, there is axillary lymph node removal. And due to this axillary lymph node removal, the lymphatic pathway is kind of damaged. Then we move on to different examples like filariasis, occlusion, Milroy's disease. Milroy's disease is nothing but abnormal development of lymphatic channels. It is kind of congenital. Then we move on to the tissue factors. Again, tissue factors, you can remember this right now if you want. I will explain it ahead in this video. Then we move on to the increased capillary permeability. Capillary is a semi-permeable membrane and doesn't allow much plasma proteins to exit. But due to some capillary poisons like histamine, anoxia, and venoms, there is decrease in plasma osmotic pressure and increase in interstitial fluid oncotic pressure, which causes edema. So these capillary poisons, what they do is they increase the gap of the capillary endothelium and allow much of the fluid and plasma proteins to exit. Example of this is angioneuritic edema, which is acute attack of localized edema. Then we have sodium water retention. Sodium water retention is nothing but the derangement in the normal regulatory mechanism of sodium and water balance. This we have learned in physiology, but yet I will be explaining this in detail in the renal edema video. So again, there are 3 ways to control it: intrinsic mechanism, extrarenal mechanism, and ADH mechanism. So these are 6 mechanisms. Let us just summarize all of this. Let us understand all the mechanisms through a basic diagram. As we know, this is a capillary and the space outside is the interstitial space. At the arterial end, there is a high hydrostatic pressure and a basic oncotic pressure. But due to decreased oncotic pressure, there will be more fluid running out of the capillary to the interstitial space. Why so? Because as we know, oncotic pressure is the one that tends to accumulate fluid together in the capillary. Next mechanism is increased hydrostatic pressure at the venular end. As you know, at the venular end of the capillary, there is low hydrostatic pressure. But if that hydrostatic pressure suddenly increases, there would be a much more pressure for the fluid to move out of the capillary into interstitial space, causing edema. Third mechanism is lymphatic obstruction. In this exchange of tissue fluids from capillary to interstitial space, there is some fluid that is left in the interstitial space which moves back to lymphatics and enters the normal circulation. But what if this lymphatics is blocked? Yeah, it won't be able to enter the normal circulation anymore, due to which there is a causation of edema. Moving to the next mechanism, that is tissue tension. Tissue factors with tissue tension. What basically this is, what I do to remember this is nothing but there is increased oncotic pressure in interstitial fluid. As we know, oncotic pressure is quite famous for accumulating fluid. So what happens if more fluid gets accumulated in the interstitial fluid? It will lead to edema. Next mechanism would be increased capillary permeability, which would be due to various capillary poisons, as we discussed a few minutes ago. And these capillary poisons leads to gapping of endothelial capillary lining, due to which a lot of fluid escapes from the gaps and enter into interstitial fluid, causing edema. So basically in this video we covered the basics of edema, the definition, classification, pathogenesis, and the different mechanisms through which it occurs. In the next video, we will be learning about very specific kinds of edema like renal, cardiac, and pulmonary edema. I hope you like this video. Thank you.